The scream wasn't the truck's. It was a human sound, thin, tearing, helpless, caught under 6 tons of impatient steel while the city stood at the curb with its hands in its pockets and its cameras out. He was somebody's son inside that sound, and in the lost breath between one honk and the next, the only person who ran was a small woman with a baby tied to her chest. Before we begin, if this kind of story speaks to your heart, feel free to share where you're watching from. It's always beautiful to see how far stories like this can travel. Enjoy the story. Title: No one helps the millionaire's son under the truck until the poor maid with her baby saves him on mornings when the light slipped in sideways through the kitchen window and painted everything with a polite sort of gold. The city almost felt kind. Elena used to believe in mornings like that. She counted coins at the table in little stacks, bus fare, milk, diapers, arranged like soldiers and just as likely to fall. Leah lay beside her in a woven sling, a small fist opening and closing on the edge of the fabric as if catching sunlight and keeping it. "Hoi, Garara," Elena whispered, leaning close until her breath warmed the baby's cheek. "Today we make the world soft." Leah blinked serious eyes. At 4 months old, her gaze often seemed older than the clock on the wall. The kettle hissed, steam curled like secrets. Elena poured water over instant coffee and stirred memories into it until the bitter turned bearable. On the peeling door, the eviction notice flapped faintly from yesterday's breeze, its ugly red stamp invisible, then suddenly there in the corner of her eye every few minutes. She had a week to make the rent. She had 3 shirts that still fit and 1 pair of shoes that pinched. She had a job cleaning the one place in the city where silence was worth money. The Hale house sat on a hill, a mansion dressed in stone and glass, overlooking a city that had learned to scream quietly. Inside, sound was allowed only if it was tasteful. Mrs. Klein, the housekeeper, used to say no noise is the best noise. Elena thought of that every time she laughed and found herself swallowing it halfway. Raymond Hale, Mr. Hale to everyone who wasn't old enough to have seen his father build the skyline, rarely smiled. He had a face like a closed fist and shoes that made no sound on the marble. His suits were cut to a discipline. He ran Hale Group, which exactly no one referred to as anything group when the contracts came through. They called it gravity. People orbited him and learned how to breathe in thin air. The first day Elena cleaned the house, she found a single thumbprint on a window 2 stories high. She wiped it away and wondered what sort of person could leave that print so impossible and expect someone else to climb for it. The second day, she saw the boy. Adrian moved like late afternoon light, disappearing around corners as soon as you looked up. 17. All elbows and a jaw he kept clenched, as if the world might try to get inside. He skateboarded through the driveway and out again when Mrs. Klein wasn't watching and could play piano so quietly it was like he was whispering to the house. If Raymond was marble, Adrian was the crack in it. Elena had been scrubbing the entryway tile when she first heard the boy's fingers on the keys. The house seemed surprised by the sound and carried it up the stairwell. Leah sighed in her sling, the tiny, contented noise of a creature who recognized rhythm. Elena closed her eyes for half a breath. Music made her chest hurt, the way rain sometimes does when you know there are places that will flood. "Don't stop," she whispered to no one and to everyone. She stayed late that day because Mrs. Klein spilled a vase and then her temper. It took a while to clean either. The bus home was full of shoulders. Her arm ached from scrubbing, her feet felt like grievances. She stared at her reflection in the window. Behind her, a billboard smiled down with improbable teeth, "Hale builds tomorrow." The company logo was steady and sure, a brand with angles meant to look like intention instead of inevitability. Elena's breath snagged, as it always did when she saw those letters. The shape of the H looked like a scaffold. She thought of Miguel. She always thought of Miguel on buses. He had been all laughter and calluses, a man who could make a joke out of hunger and a meal out of very little else. He wore his hard hat like a crown and waved from high beams, his arm a slash against the sky. The day he didn't come home, the foreman called her ma'am and honey in alternating breaths and said unusual things about load limits and unforeseen faults. "There will be compensation," he promised through his stiff suit. She had imagined clean white envelopes full of fairness. What came instead was a letter printed on quality paper, heavy and expensive, explaining in patient language that an investigation had found no liability, that he had failed to comply with safety protocols, in a way that voided what might otherwise have applied, that the company would of course keep him in their prayers. Raymond Hale hadn't signed it himself. Men like that rarely hold pens when apologies need to be written. But the logo on the letter was the same as the one on the bus billboard. It was the same as the weight in her chest. Leia's fist opened and closed against Alina's heart. Her daughter's breath was sweet milk and urgency. Alina pressed her lips to the baby's hair and tasted salt. "Gareta," she whispered, using Miguel's pet name that had more love than syllables. "I will keep you safe, I promise." Promises to babies sounded easier in kitchens. They got harder on sidewalks, and city streets were a kind of promise-breaking machine. It happened at 314 in the afternoon on a corner where 3 roads met, and none of them wanted to wait for the others. The sun had been swallowed by clouds in that tentative way early summer sometimes tries on rain. Vendors shouted in 2 languages. A bus coughed black and apologized with a squeal. Someone on a balcony watered a plant that could no longer tell the difference between enough and too much. Teenagers in uniforms spilled like dice from a bus. Adrian cut through the noise with his hood up and his headphones on, ignoring a world that always seemed to want either too much or nothing from him. An 18-wheeler edged forward, the trailer a long metal shrug. Its driver, a man with a mortgage's worry on his face and a company polo shirt one wash away from threadbare, checked his mirror, saw only impatience and tried to obey it. The light turned amber, a cyclist ran it. The driver swore and tapped the brake. The truck shuddered. A strap inside the trailer loosened, where someone had pretended earlier that it wouldn't matter. When gravity changed its mind, it didn't raise its voice. The sound the axles made when they shifted weight was a low, complicated complaint. The corner of the trailer leaned exactly enough to catch and slide. A street vendor thought about the propane tank next to his cart and moved it. A woman in a blue dress stepped back and touched her throat. A little boy dropped his ice cream. Many phones rose like flowers toward the sun. Adrian had just noticed the stray dog. It had come thinly into the street, ribs writing a poem in its sides, nose down in the gutter. He had whistles for dogs, a language that never betrayed him. He bent to coax it back to the sidewalk and didn't see the way the truck began to confess its weight. The dog darted between the wheels like water avoiding fire. Adrian went with it, one knee scraping asphalt, a laugh already forming at his own stupidity. Then steel sighed and settled and he screamed. The back of the trailer dipped enough to kiss the road and trap his arm and shoulder, a lover's cruel embrace. The world narrowed to the cold, filthy underside of a thing made to ignore anything that lay beneath it. Diesel breath filled his lungs. He tried to pull free and found the ground had turned to a hand he couldn't shake. No one moved at first. That is a lie. The driver moved, the panic in his eyes foreign and immediate. He leaped from the cab, shouting at the street in a voice that didn't yet belong to him, running both toward and away from his mistake. A bicyclist stood with one foot on the ground and both hands gripping fear. A man in a suit shouted into his phone words like liability and emergency, and I'm late. The dog trotted away as if it understood that proximity to pain is contagious and some animals refuse it. Alina stepped off the curb before her brain got a chance to write her a caution. Leia pressed her small body into Alina's ribs as if to say yes, yes, yes. "Help me," Alina shouted, her voice a rope thrown into a crowd. "We need to lift it, just enough." The driver shook his head wildly. "We can't lift that," he said, but his hands were already moving, his eyes darting to the emergency brake, to the wheel blocks that might exist somewhere if the universe was in the mood to be kind. "Jack," Alina yelled and echoed herself in a prayer. "Car Jack, anyone, please?" A man blinked and shook his head as if trying to clear a radio signal. "What if it slips?" He asked no one. "It will," Alina said flat, honest, urgent, "and we will catch it again, but we can't do nothing." She untied Leia's sling with a speed born from kitchens and nights awake with fever and 1,000 small emergencies. A shopkeeper met her eyes through the glass, his hands on the counter, an old man's hope caught in a web they called a business. She ran to him, pushed the door so hard the bell forgot how to ring, and placed Leia into his stunned arms. "Hold her," she said, her voice both apology and law. "Please, she likes humming. Anything." The man looked at the baby as if his own heart had been handed to him. He cradled Leia like an answer to a question he had meant to ask for years. Alina hit the ground and slid under the lip of the trailer. The world under there had its own weather. The asphalt radiated heat, and a history of discarded gum and spilled soda fights and rain that had come and left. Oil dripped somewhere. She could hear it counting. The smell was metal and old anger. Adrian's face was white with the effort of holding something together that clearly wanted to break. "Don't move," Elena said, which was a funny thing to say to a boy who could not. She traced quickly with her eyes the way his shoulder had gone wrong, the way his arm was pinned, the angle of the wheel close enough to his skull that she could see her own reflection in its grime-slicked chrome. I can't," he gasped. "You can," she said, "because if you say it often enough to a baby, it becomes a reflex." "What's your name?" He blinked. "Adrian." Of course it was. Names have a way of finding you when you've been looking at them and not really seeing. "Elena," she said, her palms looking for purchase. "I have a daughter. She's singing to a stranger. You and I are going to meet her later." A tool appeared beside her head like a small miracle. A car jack, red, scuffed, the sort of thing that lives in trunks and believes in usefulness. The driver had found it 2 cars down, its owner hovering, talking to it like an ancestor. "We'll need more," Elena shouted without looking, fingers scrabbling under the edge of the trailer until she found a point that wanted to be a fulcrum. Bricks, boards, anything. Someone threw down a wooden crate that had been holding oranges. Someone else kicked it to pieces with the clumsy Grace Panic Lens feet. The driver jammed the fractured wood under the lip of metal and looked at Elena for instructions like a child and like a captain. "On my count," Elena said, voice suddenly calm the way water can be after it has been rock. 1, 2, 3, they lifted, or rather they defied. The jack rose, stuttering, shaky, the trailer shifting its indecisive weight in protest. The wood held for a second and then cracked. Elena shoved a second piece in with the flat of her hand, skin burning against splinters that would introduce themselves later as pain. "Again," she said. "Again." The word became an agreement with the world that it would not end just yet. The stroller from the next block appeared. Its owner, eyes wet, pulled off its wheels and handed them to the driver, who wedged them in like prayer beads. A teen boy shrugged off his backpack and shoved textbooks under the edge. The city groaned and remembered that it had people in it. The jack inched, and the metal rose not even the width of a breath. It was enough. Elena dragged Adrian's arm free with both hands and the kind of strength that lives in women's wrists. He screamed into her shoulder, a sound like a new animal being born and trying to decide if it wants to keep living. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, my niño." She did not call him sir or young man or hey you. She called him my child, because that is what you call anyone you pull from under a truck when you are still wearing your daughter's heartbeat on your shirt. Sirens wrote themselves into the air. Paramedics appeared, all competent elbows and efficient questions. Elena slid back, her palms black with a world that never washes off, and looked for the shopkeeper with her heart in his arms. He was humming tunelessly, and Leia had fallen asleep on his chest, as if trusting is not an act of bravery but a way of breathing. "Wait," a voice shouted. "Move back, everyone, give us space." The paramedics did what a city pays them to do when it remembers to. Adrian's head lolled and his eyes fluttered open once and landed on Elena's face as if he'd wandered a desert and suddenly found water. She reached out and touched his hair, unthinkingly, because mothers cannot not reach when they see a boy trying to be brave. "Don't go," he murmured, a child's request in a voice trying to be a man's. "I'm not," she lied kindly, because the ambulance would take him somewhere she couldn't afford to go. "I'm here, I will be here." Then he was gone behind doors and wheels, and the sound of something coming back from a precipice. People suddenly found themselves in need of coffee. The crowd displaced itself into normal life with the speed of a guilty conscience. The driver sat down heavily on the curb and examined his hands, as if surprised to find them there. He looked at Elena with eyes full of a debt beyond money. He began. She shook her head. "You didn't mean it. Meaning doesn't keep people alive," he said, and then started to cry like a little boy whose mother had told him to hold the heavy end and he had dropped it anyway. Elena kissed Leia's hair and whispered into it. "Okay," she told the world. "Okay." News traveled the way it does in cities. 100 low conversations became a headline. A teenager posted a shaky video that got 1 million views before it finished uploading. Comments multiplied like mold, thick and inevitably ugly around the edges. Hero Maid. Poor woman saves rich kid. Why isn't anyone helping? Who is she? What will the father do? The captions were variations on that ancient song, the rich and the poor and the way they collide in public, the way we feed on it. Raymond Hale was in a room that smelled like lemons and distance when his phone buzzed. His assistant, Renata, knocked without looking up from a tablet that always seemed to have more questions than battery. "Sir," she said, in a tone that had never once asked him for a thing. "It's Adrian." Everything that had ever mattered to him suddenly mattered at once. He heard only pieces: accident, trapped, fine now, we think, shoulder, concussion. The ambulance is taking him to St. Gabriel's, we're on our way. He stood up and the room remembered how tall he was. The drive there was not a memory that wanted to be remembered. Lights, sirens, the wrong kind of speed. In the back of the car, his hands found each other, a habit from an earlier life when he had prayed because prayer couldn't make things worse. The hospital understood money as fluently as it knew blood. Adrian lay on a bed under glare, a bandage brilliant white against his hair. His breath slept in and out. He looked younger than 17 because boys always look like boys when they're asleep and not trying to pretend otherwise. Raymond stood beside the bed and felt the rigid geometry of his life slide out from under him. He had built a company with his father when his father still had a voice and opinions, and all the energy in the world for both. He had raised a boy with a woman who made the world messy in all the right ways, and then she had died, too quick, no one to punish, a cancer without a conscience, and the house had turned into a museum for a family that no longer lived there. This was the story if he said it in one line: built empire, lost wife, built silence. Now his son's hand, long and thin, lay on top of the sheet like an accusation. There were black streaks on his wrist that weren't his. Oil, he realized. A nurse with competent kindness explained the damaged things: dislocated shoulder, a fracture in the radial head, a concussion that would make mornings and maybe midnights more complicated for a while. He was lucky, she said, as if the word had its own gravity. If the weight had settled 1 inch more, he nodded because numbers were one of the few languages he spoke without an accent. Who pulled him out? Raymond asked. The nurse smiled, her face suddenly 13. A woman, she said. A woman with a baby. The video you haven't. I don't look at videos, he said, which was true and also not. Renata looked like she might argue with gravity itself in that moment. We'll find her, she said. We'll thank her, publicly. Privately, Raymond said, surprising himself. She did not do this for applause. No, Renata agreed, but she may not be in a position to refuse it. He hated being the kind of man who knew exactly what that meant. He sat beside Adrian and watched the slow riot of healing begin to plan itself. The boy stirred an hour later, muttered a word that was not a word, then another that was. Leia, he said. Raymond blinked. What? Leia, Adrian repeated, and then his face settled into a shape that tried to make no waves. The baby, is she? Did she? Fine, the nurse said from the doorway, because nurses know how to answer reflections when they see them. They both are fine. Who? Raymond asked. The woman. Her name, Adrian started, and then stopped, because maybe the name had been swallowed by pain. I don't know. She called me his, he caught himself. She called me a child, like I was hers. It was, he bit down on the feeling. He had learned that in the house where silence was a currency. Raymond did not recognize the emotion that rose in him, like an animal he had used to feed but hadn't visited in years. He let it climb his throat and live in his eyes. We'll find her, he said again. And beneath the promise was a question he had been avoiding for exactly as long as it had been necessary. What is the cost of a human being, and what if the answer is the exact shape of everything you own? Elena tried not to look at her phone, which was not hard because her phone was tired and old and rarely in the mood to show her what the world thought of her. Mrs. Flory's niece had texted a link anyway, and the thumbnail alone made Elena's stomach flip. Leia's sling a blue miracle against a scene that looked like it had been painted by a god with a headache. She hadn't told Mrs. Klein what happened. You didn't bring adrenaline into houses that pretended they were immune to it. She worked the next morning because clean bathrooms don't care how brave you were yesterday. Adrian was not home. The piano was quiet in a way that felt like a wound stitched badly. If she told the housekeeper where she had been, Mrs. Klein would purse her lips and say something like, "We must remember our place, Elena," and Elena would have to decide between swallowing her indignation and spitting it out. Swallowing was safer, and Elena had spent a year turning her throat into a room with a lock. She was polishing a silver bowl that would hold nothing when the door opened in a hurry and brought weather with it. Raymond came in first, Renata 2 steps behind, surprise a rare visitor on her composed face. Elena straightened on instinct, and then kept straightening because something in the air had decided it would not let her bend. Raymond stopped. Alina watched him decide whether he knew her. She would have bet money he had walked past her 100 times and nothing had been tall enough about her to cast a shadow. "You," he said. "Yes," she said, because she was suddenly tired of people with money turning everything into something more than it was. He didn't come closer, which was a kindness. He did not reach for her hand or lay claim to her courage in the public square he carried around with him. "My son," he said, the words choked with a humility that had not been born in boardrooms, "is alive." "He is strong," Alina said, "and he was lucky." "Name," Renata murmured, a question to the room and a small mercy too. "We should call you by it." "Alina," she said. "Thank you, Alina," Raymond said, and the way he said it made Renata glance at him sharply. It was as if thank you was a language he had wanted to learn as a child, but his father had insisted he take Latin instead. "Come," he said, which was not a command for once, but an invitation that knew its limits. "Adrian wants to." Alina lifted a hand. "I can't." Mrs. Klein, who had materialized in the doorway like disapproval in a sensible shoe, raised an eyebrow high enough to see the weather on the other side. "I'm working," Alina continued, "because sometimes the thing that saves your life is true because it is boring. And I have a daughter, and the bus is unforgiving." Renata blinked and looked at Alina with eyes that measured and found dimension. Then she smiled, a real one. "We'll drive you," she said. "Alina," Raymond said, and in his voice something had broken open. "Please." She was so tired of being asked for things only when people were desperate. And yet, Adrian had said her child's name like a prayer. She wiped her hands on her apron and nodded once. Hospitals smell like equal parts bleach and fear. Leia slept in her sling, oblivious to the way fluorescent lights make skin look like paper. Adrian's face went soft when he saw her. It did not turn suddenly into a child's, it turned into a person's. Alina stood beside the bed and waited until he reached for her with his eyes. "Hi," he said, which is the only thing a man can say to a woman who has seen him halfway underground. "You left." "El trabajo," she said, then she remembered herself. "Work." He smiled like he had just found out adults are silly. "Thank you," he said. "I thought I was going to die under there." It felt like he searched for a word and abandoned it. "I'm not good at asking for help." "Neither are rich men," she said, and the corner of his mouth jumped. Raymond cleared his throat. Humility doesn't always sit well in suits. "Alina," he began, and then stopped, his tongue tripping over sincerity. "I would like to, we would like to, there must be something you need." Alina thought of the letter on quality paper with the logo like a scaffold. She thought of the strange ache behind her ribs that had started the day Miguel didn't come home. She thought of the eviction notice and became suddenly angry at both it and herself for how predictable a story this would be. "Don't," she said, shocking herself with the sharpness in it. "Don't make this into an invoice." Renata's mouth opened and closed. Raymond looked stunned and then something else. "I didn't mean, you meant gratitude," she softened. "I'm not good at receiving either." "Not money," he blurted, surprising all three of them. "A debt I cannot pay with money would embarrass us both," but he hesitated, and then the animal of feeling inside him shoved him forward. Could you consider staying?" "Not as a maid," he clarified quickly when Mrs. Klein made a sound like a knife put down too loudly. As what?" Alina asked, wary and unable not to be curious. "As a person who is good to him," Adrian said, his voice careful and careful. "As a person who I don't know, this house is a mausoleum, it needs someone living in it. You brought something." Alina's face went hot. "You have a father." Adrian stared at the ceiling. "Do I?" Raymond took the blow the way men in suits think you can catch bullets with your ribs. He nodded. "He is not wrong about me," he said. "I suppose I'm asking you to not fix us, not that, just breathe here and let some of it happen." "Mrs. Klein will fire me with her eyes," Alina said. Mrs. Klein sniffed. "You wouldn't be the first person to leave by my displeasure." Raymond turned to her, and his voice came out not as the boss, but as a man who understood he had been wrong in ways that had cost him far more than money. "Klein," he said, "if you cannot learn new habits, you will find a house that requires fewer of them." Mrs. Klein stared. Then, because she had been with the family before the money learned how to wear silk, she nodded once and left with what dignity she could gather from the floor. "Please," Adrian said again, the words small and huge. "Stay." Alina exhaled like a hard storm had just remembered it was only water. "I have a daughter," she said again, the words both explanation and protection. "Bring her," Raymond said, Fill those rooms with something besides the sound of shoes on marble. Alina did not know that this moment would become a hinge in all their lives. She only knew that Leia's warm weight against her made her brave. "Okay," she said. The house did not know what to do with laughter at first. It kept putting it away and finding it again in surprising places: the hallway by the staircase, the kitchen when Alina burned tortillas and Adrian pretended to like the char, the library when Leia discovered echoes and began to sing to herself in vowels. Raymond came home earlier than he used to and found his hands learning new uses, holding a baby rinsing spinach, keeping a plate steady so someone else's fork could chase the last bite. Adrian's shoulder healed in degrees. He went back to the piano and sometimes startled himself by playing loud enough for the house to really hear. He let Leia bang fists on the low keys and called it art. The dog he had tried and failed to save found him anyway, 2 weeks later in a shelter where Adrian went, almost accidentally, seeking out the unnamed ache in his chest. He brought the thin animal home and named her Mercy without irony. Renata became Alina's strange ally, whisking her through rooms full of vocabulary and avoiding entirely the ones full of pity. If anyone asked Alina what she did for the Hales now, she said, "I clean what they cannot see." The story of the accident lived its 9 lives on the internet. Comment sections argued, talk shows pontificated. The city forgot and then learned it again when someone put up a mural near the corner where it happened, a woman with a baby, arms extended beneath a truck, like a saint with grease under her nails. The artist had given her wings. Alina blushed all the way home one afternoon when she saw it and then laughed, because she had never felt less like a saint and more like a person, which maybe was the point. Not everyone liked the change. The Hale group board, all jaws and tailored righteousness, watched their CEO begin to show up with the smell of food on him and a softness around the eyes a man gets when he knows exactly whose hair he is combing at night. They did a lot of murmuring about optics. Donors and partners and competitors asked grilling questions disguised as concern. A tabloid headline read, "Maid moves in, old house, new values." A paparazzo snapped a photograph of Alina carrying Leia past a window and splashed it across a Sunday edition like privacy was a costume they could peel away. "Let me handle it," Renata said, eyes like rain clouds coming over a mountain. Or better yet, don't handle anything. Let the noise burn itself out. Alina nodded, doing that thing where you pretend you aren't made of skin. One night, over the sink, washing a plate that could have bought her a year's rent, Alina said, not looking up, "Miguel died on one of your sites." She had not meant to. It had been living in her throat so long that it had molded to her like a second spine. She didn't drop it carefully. She just put it down and stepped back to see what it would look like in this light. Raymond stood completely still. The faucet hissed. Somewhere in the house, a clock agreed with time against its better judgment. "I didn't know," he said, finally, truthfully, but the admission did not reduce anything. It simply changed the shape of the room. Alina nodded, watching his face make room for grief that wasn't his and guilt that was. "I know you didn't. That's not an excuse. It's just a fact." "How?" He swallowed shame and then decided to keep it instead of pushing it under the rug he had learned to roll such things into. "What happened?" "Load limits," she said. "Corners cut because buying more steel would have eaten into a profit margin that already had a diet plan." He wore his helmet like prayers. "It didn't matter." She dried her hands. "A letter came. It was signed by a man whose name I don't need to say out loud. It used a lot of words to say no." Raymond leaned against the counter as if he needed it to keep him from falling and had just discovered the ground could do that too. "Renata," he called, the name a request and a vow. She materialized, the way he loved and sometimes resented her for, with a notebook that never forgave. He nodded at Alina, which in his language meant, "This is sacred and not for show." "Find the investigation report on the Chavez site," he said, his voice made of the part of him that had built buildings and still believed in foundations. "And pull every letter that went out from that legal team." "I want names, I want dates." He hesitated and then committed. "And then I want heads." "Careful," Alina said softly. "Decapitation sometimes satisfies and sometimes makes new monsters." He looked at her the way a man looks at a woman who has pulled his son from under a truck and then suggests his conscience might need a chair. He sat down. "I can't fix." "No," she said. "You can't, but you can change the next letter. You can make sure no one else gets the one I did." Raymond blew out a breath and nodded once like a promise to a god he wanted to believe in. "Yes." The board reacted like a body to an unexpected sharp object when he brought it all into the clean, bright stink of a meeting room. Men shifted behind expensive ties. Women whose mouths had learned to smile without consent frowned prettily. He laid it out. The cuts, the letters, the math that always found a way to pretend the human had been accounted for. He fired 3 people in one day and felt nothing numb about it. He announced an independent audit of every site with teeth in it. He started a fund from his own account and called it Mercy and refused publicity. He did not put his name on the plaque. Someone in that meeting said words like shareholder and fiduciary and public relations nightmare. Raymond said, "We build things. People live in them. Let's build something out of that sentence." They voted to keep him for the moment, mostly because they didn't know what the internet would do if they didn't. Adrian laughed more now, which you would not think a boy with a healing arm and a chronic feeling of wrong-angledness would do. He found reasons. Leah Belly laughed at a dog being itself. Mercy learned to catch treats with the sort of earnestness that convinces you goodness is not a myth. Alina told stories about Miguel that didn't end at the site and then one day did, and instead of stopping the room, it let it breathe. Raymond stepped in for those breaths and out again when needed, like a man who has learned to swim what used to drown him. Then Leah got sick. It began like small things do. A bluish tinge above her lip when she cried too hard. The doctor at the clinic that smelled like paint said murmur and monitor and probably nothing. Then probably nothing turned into we should take a look, which became some congenital issues are manageable, and then a sentence that contained surgery and sooner and specialist and waiting list. Alina sat very straight in a chair that was trying to be both sturdy and kind and felt like neither. The hospital had good art on the walls, as if that could distract you from the way hope was scheduled. "How long?" she asked. "A month," the doctor said, bracing with a smile. "Maybe 2. "Alina," Renata said later, gently, when Alina told them because she had now learned which burdens could be held without breaking the hands that held them. "We can," she counted words and found the right ones. "Would you allow Raymond to call in favors?" Alina's back snapped straight. "Pride is a muscle. If you use it too much, it cramps." "No," she said, instantly and because she needed to. Raymond nodded, holding the panic quiet behind his teeth. "We will not apply pressure where others wait, but I can make sure the surgeon looks at her file today, that he knows her name, that he answers the phone when her mother calls, not his assistant." Alina looked down at Leah, who blinked up at her as if born familiar with bureaucracy. She had spent enough of her life being told to wait by people whose waiting never felt like an ache. There is a difference between choosing principle and sacrificing your child on a pyre of it. She put her pride down like a small knife she would pick up again later. "Okay," she said. "Okay." The surgeon turned out to be a human being in a white coat, which always surprises people. He listened with his whole head. He bent over Leah and called her boss in a way that made Alina laugh at entirely the wrong moment and save herself by pretending to cough. He rearranged things that had been nailed to an invisible calendar because he could. Leah went in for surgery 2 weeks later on a morning when the sky had just decided to clear, as if it wanted to see better. The waiting room was an invention meant to keep people from tearing down doors with their bodies. Alina sat between Raymond and Adrian and held both of their hands and could feel the ways they held back and the way they did not and loved them with a ferociousness that scared her. The struggle wasn't blood, it was permission. Renata brought them terrible coffee and refused to apologize for it like it was a talisman you have to subject to the world for protection. Mrs. Klein appeared with sandwiches Alina was fairly certain had been made with actual tenderness. When the surgeon came out, still becoming human again in the way of a man who has come from a bright room where the heart is not a metaphor, he said, "She did well. She is small, but her will is impressive, boss-like." He smiled, and Alina's body remembered how to be a body. Alina cried then, in a way that was not a crisis anymore, but a celebration and a cathedral. Raymond rested his forehead on the back of his hand, and Adrian stood up and walked to a window and looked out at a city that had tried to end him and now was letting him live in it. The next morning, a reporter waiting outside said, "Mr. Hale, how does it feel to know your money saved a life you didn't?" He didn't get to finish because Raymond said, quietly and like a man pronouncing a benediction, "Her mother saved my son with hands that had washed my floors. I owe my days to that woman. Money only bought time for me to become someone who deserved it. That is the truth. The paper can print the parts it knows what to do with." They filmed him anyway. The internet did something surprising. It went quiet for a while. People shared the mural that made Alina a saint and then argued only a little about whether a halo was insulting to the secular. Alina took Leia home. She slept in a room where once there had been only furniture, and now there were blankets and bottles, and late nights singing with Adrian, who learned lullabies like he learned scales. The Hale mansion stopped trying to pretend it was anything but a house. Being loved is complicated when you are poor and suddenly the people loving you occupy too many column inches. Alina woke up some mornings, and the first thought in her head was rent, even though the word had become a ghost in this house. She would carry that first thought into the kitchen, and it would unravel slowly over coffee and someone passing her a baby spoon and the small nonsense that saves us daily. It couldn't last. Things rarely do in one shape. The board called a vote. Some of them had waited patiently for a moment when principle could be disguised as prudence. Responsibility, they said. Shares, they said. Leadership, they said, addressing a man who had just learned how to be led and thus was finally becoming a leader. Raymond stood at the head of a long table that had hosted only war dressed up as dessert and thought, briefly, that he could fight his way out of it. Then he saw Renata's face across from him, that look she saved for moments when the only right move was listening. He looked at the men and women around him and saw for the first time that he hated this room. "I built this what you insist on calling empire," he told them, and managed not to call it a mistake because he did not believe it had been. "We made beautiful things and also terrible decisions. I will not pretend those things are not linked. You want me to captain the ship without ever changing where it's going. I won't." He took the word and turned it over in his mouth like a coin. "I resign," he said, and the coin landed and showed the right side. They thought it was a bluff until he took off his tie, and then even the ones who didn't know they had been trapped in a prison with expensive locks felt something shift. He did not leave them without a plan. He offered them a successor who had been waiting in competence for years and who understood cement better than she understood social events. He told them the foundation they would fund, whether they liked it or not, would be independent, transparent, loud about its failures and quiet about its successes. He gazed at them a long, almost tender moment. "Gentlemen," he said, purposely misgendering several people because sometimes you have to call out a joke for it to remember itself. "You will be fine." He went home and put his forehead on Alina's shoulder because that was the place where the world made any sense. "What will you do?" she asked. "Build things," he said, and she laughed and then cried because that word could be orchestrated to mean so many other things. They started in the neighborhood where the mural was. They opened a center with lights that didn't flicker and a kitchen that didn't judge. They put a sign over the door that said mercy in letters Leia could one day trace. They taught people how to use car jacks, how to hold a neck while waiting for ambulances, how to say "you can" to strangers without it sounding like a lie. Alina stood in a room full of mothers and said, "You are stronger than physics," and if that wasn't strictly true, it was functionally true, which is the kind that saves lives. The driver from the accident came to the opening. He shook Alina's hand with both of his and told her he had quit the company with the polo shirts and found a union job that paid a little and protected a lot. He let her meet his daughter and then tried to apologize again. She put a finger to his lips. "Meaning doesn't keep people alive," she said. "But it can keep us humane." Adrian played piano on Thursday nights for anyone who needed to hear a boy translate what had almost happened into sound. Mercy lay under the keys and dreamed. Leia learned to stand, and then the world was equal parts terror and joy as she used everything to pull herself up, and then everything to fall down again. On the 1-year anniversary of the accident, they went back to the corner where it happened. The city grumbled about the traffic jam caused by the ceremony, and then the same city cried when the speeches didn't try to sell it anything. A new plaque stood near the mural, one that didn't have a name on it so much as a question: who will you be when it's your turn? Underneath, smaller, in honor of those who lifted and those who must still be lifted. People placed flowers and jokes and promises. Raymond spoke briefly and got choked up only once, which was a miracle considering how little practice he'd had for that kind of honesty in public. Adrian read a poem he hadn't told them he'd written about gravity and grace. He put its last line in the simplest language he could: "Weight can crush you or teach you. Today it teaches." Alina didn't want to speak, but it was one of those days where the world looks at you gently, and you realize the only way to repay that is to say the thing you haven't said out loud yet. I was angry, she began, voice stable. When Miguel died and the letter said no, I thought the world had decided my grief was a clerical error. I did not forgive. I worked. I held my baby and made promises you can only make when the person you are promising them to cannot call you on the math. Then the truck happened, not for me, not to me, but near me, and I went because we go. Not because we are brave, but because we are built for it. She looked out at the faces and saw so many kinds of hunger. I am standing here with a man whose name used to be a bruise in my mouth and is now, what, a friend, a kind of family. I don't know how to call it. I know I watched him change in a way that cost him, and that feels like a miracle I didn't know to pray for. I know his son loves my daughter with the uncomplicated devotion of an older brother who knows what it is to need someone to stay. I know I am not a saint. If you put a halo on me, I will ask you to hold Leia while I fix dinner so you can find out what long hours really make you into. Laughter like rain when the roof is good. I know that that day, no one moved at first, and then someone did, and then someone else. That is how we survive this city. That is how we become worthy of our own names, move, and then keep moving. The applause felt like weather changing, not the dramatic kind, the kind you notice only when you realize you have taken your sweater off without realizing it. They went home to a house that had roots. Raymond made pasta and undercooked it and refused to accept that it wasn't intentional. Adrian and Alina exchanged the look of people who had learned how to lovingly bully a man into not pretending. Renata showed up with a cheap bottle of wine and embarrassment that she had bought something cheap. Mrs. Klein came late and stayed long. The dog begged for garlic bread and did not receive it, and managed to look both betrayed and forgiving. Leia fell asleep with her cheek against Adrian's knee under the piano. Alina stood in the doorway and watched a life she had not asked for, and would not, for anything, return. After dinner, when dishes made their small, intimate music in the sink, and the house took on that soft, tired breathing a good home has, Adrian wandered out onto the balcony. The city stretched below, a dangerous animal that occasionally rolled over and let you pet its belly. "Hey," he said when he heard Alina behind him. He did not turn because some moments are easier in profile. "Hey," she said, leaning on the railing, "you almost died a year ago today." "Yeah," he said, a teenager pretending to bravado and failing just enough to be human. "Thanks for that," she elbowed him. "You saved me too, you know," he frowned. "How?" "You made me stay," she said, "in a place I would have left as soon as it felt like it might want me. You said please like a boy who knew the value of the word. You and your father made my daughter a future where she will be a nuisance to many people in positions of minor authority." "That is the only future I ever wanted for her." Adrian laughed. "She will get suspended in 3rd grade for organizing a protest about something important like juicebox equity." "Exactly." They stood until the night gathered itself around their shoulders. The city glowed and pretended not to be tired. For once, it didn't feel like a performance, it felt like a truce. Epilogue, the middle of the story. No one tells you that happy endings require maintenance. You have to oil the hinges. You have to patch the roof. You have to say, "I'm sorry," in voices you're still figuring out how to make. Alina set alarms, rent. Just because you can pay it doesn't mean you don't remember it. Dentist, board meeting, the foundation one. The kind you leave not perfect but honest. School open house. Piano recital. City council hearing about the crosswalk at the corner with the bad sight line. The one where the paint has given up and the cars pretend not to see. Raymond learned to cook 2 dishes decently. He sometimes went into rooms where decisions were made and said, "Think of Alina standing under that truck and tell me your answer again." And occasionally it worked. Adrian grew taller and slouched less. Mercy got fat. Leia did a bad thing with 3 markers and an expensive chair and was forgiven because children will teach you where your lines are and why you drew them. Once at a grocery store, a woman touched Alina's elbow and said, "You are her, the woman from the video." Alina smiled politely and tried to shake the roll like raindrops. The woman said fiercely, "You made me help last week. There was a car, nothing horrible, just a woman fallen beside it with her groceries spilled, and I went. I didn't wait for anyone else. You put something in me." She tapped her chest. "Here." Alina went home and told this to the house, and the house said nothing because houses don't talk, but it felt warmer for hours. On an ordinary Tuesday, they were cleaning up cardboard from a delivery, because even in a mansion life comes in boxes sometimes when Renata texted a photo of a girl leaning in front of the mural. She had a baby on her back and a grin like a dare. Underneath, Renata wrote, "Look, it's already traveling." Elena put her phone down and knelt to pick up a last scrap of tape. Leia toddled over and handed her a spoon. Elena took it as if it were a medal. Nobody helps the millionaire's son under the truck. Not at first. But then somebody does, and then someone else, and that is the only story worth telling, repeated with different names in different cities until we finally understand it. Elena kissed her daughter's forehead and Miguel's name inside her mind, and Raymond laughed at something in the other room, and Adrian hit a wrong note and laughed harder. And that was how the mansion learned to exhale. Every mistake admitted aloud. Every meal made together. Every hand held when a cut needed not a bandage but attention. It wasn't perfect. It was theirs. And if you listened at night when the city groaned and trucks complained, and somewhere a siren wrote its letter of emergency into the air, you could hear the house answer in a new language it had learned from the woman who moved under a truck with a baby on her chest. "I am here. I will move. I will not wait to be asked."